is mainly the Trojan people, right?
Yeah.
We think so. But
Yeah.
there are also some in Wales, and also Cymru in England. They didn't take defined areas so much.
Right.
But you say the Cymru were the west side of, and Trojans the other. And the English attitude in the 19th century, trying to promote Anglo-Saxonism all the time, promoting these German kings, right?
Yeah.
Was that the Trojan War never happened. It was a myth.
Yeah.
Therefore, any history based on something that never happened as a myth had to be junk history, and they threw it out. They suddenly threw the entire history out. Bang, out it goes. So out goes the history of Alboin coming here from Syria in sort of 1400, 1500 BC, which is eminently provable. Out went the Trojan War, the Trojans. So all British history could be abandoned because they were founded on lies.
Okay.
Well, if you restore the Trojan War to reality, it's not a myth or a legend, you're right. And clearly it didn't take place between 1135 or 1334. The Greeks have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
It did take place and can be traced very clearly to about 650, 638 BC.
Right.
Now, once you got the date of the Trojan War right, all these other histories around the Middle East that are out of displaced.
Mm-hmm.
For 400 years and 500, 600 years out of place. Rip Van Winkle lands, nobody there. They all fall into place.
Okay. Now, Alan, in the very first program that I recorded with you, I suggested various motives which could be behind the problems that you've had, and I said that it's possibly upsetting to royalty, it's possibly Freemasonic, it's possibly the Catholic Church, or there's a whole, and other groups as well that are possibly behind the smear attempts that you've had. We don't really know who it is, but you actually wrote to the Queen before you'd written any books to ask if this research was going to be upsetting to them. Just tell us about that letter.
Well, we just wrote a letter saying we intended going into these genealogies and this history, and obviously it could have an effect on history, and they're dependent upon history, aren't they?
Yeah.
We were brief enough, and there weren't any objections, and he said, no.
So you got a reply. We'll show that letter on the screen from the Queen's. I don't know. It wasn't.
Oh, one from her herself, but I mean, obviously she may have been consulted, but some people didn't think there was any problem.
But they said we've got no problem with it as long as you don't associate our name with it. They didn't want to.
They didn't want to be
associated.
They didn't rubber stamp it. We're not correct, as if they're not going to say we're correct.
But they're not going to object to it.
They're not object to it.
Okay. Well, now, just as I said at the beginning of the show, Alan, people who want evidence, because there's a great deal of evidence in your books. You've got hundreds of inscriptions and manuscripts and stone carvings, and all kinds of evidence is presented in those books. And as we said, the TV is not really the forum in which to present all that evidence. It's in the books.
Well, it's not all in the books. We could write another 4 or 5 books.
Right. Okay. Now, based on the research that you've done, you believe there are certain, let's just call them treasure sites or sites that you think there are cities or there are artifacts. Can you list them, Alan? Don't necessarily have to list exactly where they are, but if we start with is it Munadagaya?
Munadagaya, Fortress Mountain.
Fortress Mountain. Now that's just northeast of Bridgend, am I right?
Yes.
So just summarise what you think is under the ground there. We've got the remains of St Peter's Church. So that's clearly recognisable. No one disputes that. Tell us what else you think is on that mountain.
Well, there is just above it the remains of an ancient castle, and that's abundantly clear.
And do you suspect that was used by
Caradoc the First?
Caradoc the First.
Yeah, in Roman times, fought the Romans. There's the burial of King Moirig, Arthur's daddy's up there.
Right. And that's in a big circle.
Well, he's in the giant circle at Caradoc, you see.
Right.
And there is a huge bolt-shaped mound. All early Christian churches was bolt-shaped.
Right.
And there's one down at Nash Point.
Right.
King Kerry's buried in it. Because that's why they call it, the main body of a church is a nave. Nave, navally. It's the Roman word, or Latin word for a boat.
Right.
You see, you're in a ship. And
so what else is under the ground there?
Then you've got the Monument of the Soldiers, Great Monument of the Soldiers. There was a terrible massacre. The Saxons and the Brits had a peace conference about 456, something like that. Saxons brought concealed weapons. Well, they would, wouldn't they? And when they'd drunk too much beer, they massacred 383 British leaders at a peace conference.
Mm-hmm.
The English try and write that this was a battle up in the north of England, and the Welsh used to get drunk before the battle, and they all got killed, which is complete fantasy.
All right.
It's a massacre at a peace conference. But nonetheless, that's there. There's St. Peter's Church, and there's a crypt under that church.
Mm-hmm.
All churches in Britain were named after the founder. That church goes back to the 1st century AD. You work it out.
Now, you also claim that there are fortresses on the side of that mountain.
Yes, there are.
I mean, can you see
there's
remains
the
of
ancient ironworks where they used to smelt their iron anciently up there.
that? And is there something further down the mountain?
Well, there's a monument to Millway where they buried all these 383 dead
Right.
nobles. There's a treasure site up there, a vast one, very big, where our man Alan Hassel and we've seen it on film.
Right.
There are no end of bits and pieces up on that mountain. It's a huge thing.
So do you suspect that there was a town or a city further down the mountain?
There is there are trees as the road. You go up the road to get up there, and there are a lot of trees you can't see to the side. You go mini forest.
Right.
But if you look on Google Earth, and everybody told us in the village, there's lots of ancient ruins under the ground. They're like streets of houses. You can see them sticking up.
Right.
Under the ground. So there is a place there. Well, if that's Caercaradoc, there's the lost town of King Caradoc.
Right.
Well, that's Caercaradoc. There's a
Right.
town
So you think
King
the
Caradoc.
town of
He
King
wouldn't live up
Caradoc-
on the mountain 900 feet up in the wind. He'd live down on the
Right.
bottom where it's nice and
So
sheltered.
So you think there's a town at the
There
bottom?
is a buried town.
A
you
buried
know.
town there.
It is. There's no doubt about
Right.
it.
You also think there's a palace outside.
Oh, well.
Is it Llantwit Major?
Yeah, Llantwit Major, Llaniltyd
Tell us what that is and why.
Llaniltyd Vawr, the great, the church of the great Iltyd, who was the first cousin of King Arthur. But in the fields there, just to the north, about a mile north, there remains of a gigantic palace, about 4 acres of it, in an 11-acre site. I got the date wrong last time.
Mm-hmm.
They started excavating it around 1881, 1882.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, they know that the walls that protrude through the earth are still 9 feet high below ground. They're about 3 feet thick.
So you've said they should be excavating that site.
Well, Mallory says that Camelot's in southeast Wales. He also says the place in the other records says white. There's loads of white marble scattered all over the fields.
But you don't think Camelot is at Llantwit Major. You think
Well,
it's
once that was destroyed, they had to go somewhere else.
all right. So that
So,
was destroyed.
In after the second reign.
Right. And then they took
Then they went up to north of Cardiff.
Right, which is the Yellow Fortress.
Yes, right.
So just explain where that is, Alan,
But
and what you think's there.
the great palace at Llantwit Major is the Palace of the Kings.
Right.
Of course, Wales is a kingdom, not a principality. That's going to upset them.
Mm-hmm.
So too bad.
So the Yellow Fortress, just tell us about that.
Well,
we did mention
North
it in
of
the
Cardiff is Caermelin, and Caermelin could be Camelot, obviously. That would have been then a major. It was the major royal residence, and it was in a cantref, like a little county there, which could never be taxed. Not even in Norman times you couldn't tax that area. That's the royal cantref.
So suggest it was more important than Cardiff at some point in time.
Well, Cardiff is in the parliamentary 100 of Caermelin. The parliamentary 100 wasn't Cardiff and that place in it. It's the other way round. So if the parliamentary 100 a few hundred years ago is in that field, as it were, you know, it's
So
got to
Caermelin-
be. It's got to be
Camelot.
important, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And you couldn't tax it.
Now, you think that one of the reasons why the archaeology department at Cardiff University maybe don't entertain some of your claims, such as Camelot being at Caermelin, is that you can actually see that site from the out the window from Cardiff
Yeah.
University.
Yeah. Well, they went digging. Oh, look, most of the people in the university, I think, will be all right, you know. But you get the guy in charge, and you got this Alcock was there he came there in 1945 claiming to be an archaeologist, which he was not. He had no degree in archaeology and none in history. And he came there after the war. You can imagine millions of men coming out of the armed forces, milling about, people still being called up to go in the forces into Germany. And there was chaos, and so they gave him a job. And he worked his way up in the archaeology department. He became professor.
All right. Well,
He's from Carlisle, so he knows a lot about Wales, wouldn't he? You know.
yeah. So if Caermelin was excavated, what do you think would be found? I know
The
I'm asking you to make
ruins of a
assumptions.
castle. Well, it's known
Ruins
that
of a
there was a
castle.
castle. There was a wedding at the castle in 1454. So the castle was there. See, you leave a castle in Wales in ruin, or leave it there. The farmers come along with their carts, and they're going to
Make all
start
the
building
stone,
houses
yeah.
in barns. And, you know,
Yeah.
and
Well, they did that
it
in
was a
they did that
castle.
in Egypt
It's
when
called Castle Field today. You
they
see.
did that in Egypt
Of course they did.
the sides fell off the pyramid after
Well,
an
they took
earthquake.
them off, didn't
Yeah.
they? Anyway.
Okay, so any other sites, Alan? Well, because you also
Yeah, well, we
think
were down in West Wales. We
there's
were very
the
active in West Wales.
cave that we
There's a
featured where
cave
you
there.
think the Holy Cross is.
Well,
So that's where. Just you don't have to tell us exactly
well, it's
where
at
it is.
Nevin.
In Nevin.
The point is that metal detectors can't lie,
Uh,
and if a metal detector identifies an object in the right place, of the right size, and it's non-ferrous metal, it's looking at a silver casket, then I think you've got a good chance.
And you think you've located the burial site of
Empress Helen. Oh yeah, a lot of evidence for that.
Right,
Yeah.
and where's that?
That's again just south of Nevin.
South of Nevin.
Yeah.
Right, and any other sites that you think need excavating in
Well,
those
you know,
areas?
you could dig up all over the place. We were friendly with a guy from the Rhondda, and he had a colleague down in West Wales, and there was some very bad scrubland. He was a farmer, so he fenced it off, and he put his goats in there. Well, a goat will eat anything.
Right.
It'll eat brambles and weeds, it'll eat anything. And they cleared the land, and there was the ruins of a big, huge villa, you see.
Really?
And we think that's where the princes, of a known line of princes, would have lived, you see.
Yeah.
So there's masses of places, battle sites. You know, you can find the Battle of Badenside, the Battle of Camlan, the Longbourth. You can find the grave of the prince who was killed in the Battle of Longbourth. And there are so many sites. There's the grave of the sons of Arthur, killed in the war with the Vandals, well known, and kept in good nick. So, yeah, look, there are so many sites. Look, up in Mid Wales, they found the burial of a major prince or king. Traditionally, he's wearing golden shirt or golden cloak. They dug it up about 1850, and it's in the British Museum. It's one of their great treasures. Why it's in England, I don't know. Well, there's another one on the borders where there's a guy buried wearing a golden shirt. Now, we've been there. There's a huge mound there. They're trying to say it's an old Saxon saint. Saxon minor saints were poverty-stricken, and he didn't wear golden. We know it's the grandson of Arthur II, right? Who was Gwaednoth, mighty in blood, and he's known to the English as Caswallon, meaning viceroy. Anyway.
Okay, Alan. Well,
but there's loads of sites.
Right. And just before we go to the break, if there was a change of heart in academia and they, took on board your work, what do you think the chances of getting these sites excavated would be? Do you think this archaeological trust would go, yeah, let's go for it?
No, I don't want to go near the archaeological trust. The Morgan Gwent archaeological trust.
Well,
I wouldn't
yeah,
touch
well,
it. I wouldn't trust them with a
Yeah, I know that.
matchstick.
Okay, but public money, if public money was put behind your work, do you think that can happen? I mean, perhaps if we can get this place at Unisabul excavated, maybe that would be a catalyst.
Well, they should be excavating all of them, because all we're saying is, there's the spot, dig a hole.
Yeah.
We can literally, look, you know that after the war there were lots of millions of shells unexploded in the land in Germany, hundreds and even thousands of bombs from the Russians and us bombing hell out of Germany, and they were deep down, and an awful lot were unexploded. Most did go off, but we dropped so many of them. And so the Germans had a problem with something 20, 30 feet down, 500-pound bomb or even 1,000 pound. And they had to develop deep reading metal detectors, which are very, very good. And that's what you can use. So there's no question about these artifacts being there. It's not up for grabs. Right. It's not up for question.
The company that has offered to help with another scan of Unisabul does have that metal detection equipment. We mentioned academia. Now, surely there must be one or two cases where a professor has wanted to support your work.
Oh, well, you know, Professor John Collis of Sheffield, independent of us, he spoke at the conference in Cardiff and he said, look, there are no Celts in Britain, there never were. See, nobody thought the British, in the sense of the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish, were Celtic before 1714. The arrival of the Hanoverians. You've got to give them, if you destroy somebody's history, you've got to give them a new identity. And that oh, they're Celts. The Welsh are not Celts, neither are the Scots, and I don't think the Irish. It's a complete diversion. It's camouflage.
So did this guy want to promote your work?
Well, he was hammered by his, all the archaeologists went bananas, you know. Archaeologists are not historians. Then we had, before that, independent of us, Dr. Victor Klube of Oxford, an astrophysicist, and he said, look, a comet must have struck Britain around, you know, the middle of the 6th century. Perfectly correct. Comet destroyed much of Britain and Ireland. And he then got flack from everybody, you know. And so the few who, Professor Michael Bailey was luckier later. He came up with dendrochronology, and he said all the forests of Britain and Ireland were destroyed in the mid-6th century by ash from a Krakatoa volcano in the Pacific. Yeah. And we wrote and said, look, it's not ash from the Pacific, specifically destroying forests in Britain and Ireland, nowhere else. It's the comet. He then changed his mind and he said, yeah, it's a comet. Right. No, the comet figures hugely in our histories. Oh. Devastates the Arthurian Britain.
Now, just before we move on with the Arthurian stuff, Alan, I just want to mention, in Programme 1 we covered an event which happened in this house where there was a serious fire.
Yeah.
Your colleague was in a coma. It was a horrendous time for you, and as mentioned in the previous show, we're trying to get the police to investigate this. And just to update viewers on what's happening, there has been some correspondence from the police. I haven't at this point in time had any correspondence because I wrote to the police. They still haven't replied to me. I've sent them a copy of the video. Now, they have corresponded with Alan, and we don't really want to say what was said, but what we will say is that you are taking and possibly going to pursue certain lines of action based on what they've said, because they've not, let's just say it's not fully satisfactory what they've come back and said.
Well, it's the usual performance whenever we've been attacked. You know, we've had numerous attacks, not from the police up here in Newcastle, but before we've got at. Their attitude is one of negativity and indifference. In other words, they've got a carpet and they're going to sweep it under it.
Yeah. It's as if, just from my own opinion, from what I've seen of their response, it's as if they're going to ignore it and play it down and seemingly just hope it goes away. Now, we're not going to let that happen because the evidence is blatant as far as I'm concerned in that video.
Well, they've been told to ignore it.
You think so?
I think so.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
I think this thing is too persistent, too widespread. It's possible that people in high places, shall we say, have realised that we weren't a pair of minor characters, dummies, going to do a little handbook of 20 pages paperback in Cardiff. We were something different. It's like you step on the tail of a snake, you know, and you might think, oh, it's only a little snake, but it bites you, you're dead. You know, it's not a worm.
And you know, when the time is right, I will report on what happens with regards to that investigation.
Look, we tried very hard. With the gaps in our work, we did everything we could to get this project out of Britain. We went to America, thought we'd transfer the entire attention there because of Arthur II and his brother Maddox going to America, and so. We've tried to get things out that way, out of Britain, the backtrack into the Middle East, and out into we've tried everything to get out of Britain, you know.
Is that because you think people in those countries are more likely to receive that history better and believe it?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I was privileged enough to be asked to do the Bemis lecture, which is an annual lecture in Cambridge, just outside Boston. And after the lecture, I had a guy come up to me, and he was well dressed in his English type, you know. And he was from the embassy in Washington. He'd come to the URL to say, and he was very, you shouldn't be saying things like this. You shouldn't be. Right. Didn't want it.
So let's because we haven't mentioned that throughout this series, Alan, but let's just touch on it. You have uncovered Colburn inscriptions in America?
No, we haven't.
You haven't.
American historians have, and researchers, and they've been doing it certainly since 1900 and earlier.
One area is in Kentucky.
Kentucky's the major area, northern, southern Tennessee.
Right. So tell us what evidence has been found in Kentucky which suggests that British settlers or explorers arrived there prior to 600 AD.
Well, the first thing, everybody forgets that the Native Americans were maybe living they weren't all living in tents on the prairies. They had towns, and they built wooden buildings, perhaps more primitive than ours and so on. And they had associations, sometimes 10, 12,000 people in towns. There were millions of them, but they died in the millions from white man's diseases and so on. And these were not as the primitive people that people often are led to believe. And they had histories. No, the Delaware had a history, and others. Two of these histories were then, they wrote them on sticks. Well, the Welsh used to write on sticks, you know that? Colburn is written on sticks, that's a straight stroke alphabet. Certainly, I think it was a Dr. Ward got hold of the one major history, and it was translated. The Indian chief translated what was on the sticks. Remember, he wrote it all down, and they gave him bundles of sticks, the histories. They finished up in the hands of Rafinesque, who was the first sort of real pioneering academic setting up universities in the Midwest. And so these histories relate how a great race of white men arrived there, and they describe where these white men were.
So the language on the sticks is what?
Well, I don't know what the language is on the sticks.